Way too early. Alright, morning. This is why I keep asking people to join me on Patreon. I get up at maybe 5 in the morning to start editing videos for the first few hours of my day. We're back on planking the 2.4, and we've made it through the really tough part, which is the tuck. So as I progress forward, I found the simple system of scribing one plank to the next worked pretty good for me. That involved using a set of dividers, parking one plank against the other, leaving a little gap, and running a set of dividers along there. And then I was taking two pieces of material, sticking them together, and cutting two planks at once, one for one side, one for the other. It works just fine. However, no boat is 100% symmetrical. And when you want to fit the plank that was for the side that was not scribed to, you had to do a little more work. As you do that, you start incurring incremental error. Just a little bit, but it adds up. And at some point, the plank you scribe for one side doesn't nearly fit as well for the plank that you have on the other side. It's just the way it goes. And so you need to stop and try and do some corrections. Now, hindsight is 20/20, as they say, and as I look back at this footage, I can see other ways that I should have approached this. Why it didn't occur to me at that time, I don't know. Hopefully, for the next layer, I've learned some lessons, but I don't know, because I haven't looked through that footage yet. We'll get to that pretty soon. For now, let's finish planking this boat. This is Nomad Boat Building. I'm Mark Rudin, and this is a 2.4 meter project. Let's go get to work.
Okay, our planking's coming along pretty good, but I noticed when I did a comparison from side to side that we're getting out of sync a little bit. We're out by maybe a 1/4 inch or something like that from one side to the other. It's not a huge deal, but because I'm making these planks in pairs, it's really nice if I can have them coordinate, be exactly the same or as close to that as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay off a mark for my next plank that's going to be consistent from one side to the other. And we're going to spile the next two planks individually so that when we put them on, in theory, the results will both be the same, and we can go back to cutting them in pairs. So to do that, what I'm doing is I'm using my story pole tape measure here, and I've picked off exactly where the last plank is landing here, and that's how I can compare it to the other side. We're going to shave back on our plank width by maybe an extra 1/4 inch or something to make up for that difference so that we can get them both exactly the same. So whereas right now we've got to go to about 4 3/16 inch on a finished plank width, we'll go say 3 7/8 or something on the next one. So 2, 3, 3 7/8, something like right there. And so when I set up to spile for the next plank or scribe for the next plank, I'm going to come back a little piece. And we're just going to make sure up at the top that we're working off the same line. So that's the important thing. The top matches because we're working in pairs and we're coming to the same point on the top, but it's down here at the shear that things change up a little bit. So I'm going to lay off the same dimension on the other side, and I'll just mark it right here onto my tape measure, so that when I go to the other side and make my finished plank dimension, or where I'm going to scribe from, it's going to be equal from side to side. So up here at the bow, I've just given myself a little cleat that my tape measure hooks onto, going right across a common line so that each time I hook this, I'm hitting it on the same spot. And we're just throwing a clamp here just to make sure the tape measure doesn't jump off. Here I've got the exact same mark as on the other side. So at least assuming that the contour of the shear is the same side to side, and it's very close because we made our molds in mirrors, and this should be quite accurate. If I compare that. Yeah, so we're about 3 3/4, something like that. I'll just quickly check my new plank. Yeah, and we'll be losing about a 1/4 inch off of this plank in order to get that finished width. So that works pretty good. Okay, I'm going to spile for this plank now, and normally I would use this sort of method where I would use a set of dividers and we'd set it to just a hair wider than our widest gap and draw them along. And that works fine, but it's when you've got a wider piece, it's a lot easier to have the divider sort of go off kilter on you. So I usually reserve that for one that I'm using closing up a smaller gap. So for this, I've just cut a piece of scrap that's just a little bit wider than our plank here. And I'm going to use it to sort of guide me. So I'm just going to run this along here. And that's going to be our finished plank width right there. So I'll use the same spacing on the other side, and I'll make sure that I set up this plank at that same distance. So in theory, assuming that everything's gone well and we are careful to lay off things in the right spot, we should end up with this finished plank matching from side to side. So we'll try this, we'll see if that's what works out, and it should, in theory it should, but there's always things that go wrong. But so that's sort of a very simple method of what we call scribing, not spiling. Spiling would be creating a pattern in this void to fill it up with a new plank. This is scribing, where we're using the shape of one plank, just scribing it directly onto the part that you want to fit. So we differentiate those terms by that. All right, so that plank is cut now, and I'm just going to stick it in place and see how it fits. And for the most part, that's pretty good. Now, I expect it wasn't going to be 100% bang on, because when this plank was sitting out this few inches farther out, well, it's a very different shape, given how quickly the shape changes on this particular boat. If you're on a much larger hull, it'd be more consistent and be a little bit easier to fit these things with that kind of method. But for the most part, this is getting us to 98% of the way there, so that's pretty good. I'm just going to do a little bit of tweaking to sort of coerce it to a finished tightness that I like, and then I'm going to bevel off my edges for gluing. Through the midship area of the hull, the shape got easy enough that I could get away without steaming the planks, and I could also get away with fastening them on in threes. Epoxy is applied to the keelson and deadwood, and temporary screws with fender washers hold the planks in place while we finish the rest of the fastening procedure. So after much experimentation, I found the best little cleats to put over these seams happens to be scraps from the planking. They seem to have just about the right sort of thickness so that they don't crush underneath the staples. Compared to up here, I've got some of the popsicle sticks. And while they're nice and convenient in that they're pre-made, they all seem to sort of collapse underneath the staples, and they don't really pull down the planking the way I'd like it. And these little pieces of yellow cedar just seem to do a better job. And I find that they sort of break free fairly easily. I gave them just a quick smearing with wax. See if I just run my pry bar underneath them, they lift up pretty good. I'm just kind of breaking the bond here. And then with some of them you can just push them down a little. And then I picked up a staple lifter, which seems to be doing a nice job. And those that sort of survive the experience, I'm just throwing back into my apron to reuse. Not that they have any great value, but it's faster to reuse something that's sitting right there than it is to fart around making some new ones. Although making them is pretty darn fast. With the popsicle sticks, I was screwing around with a chisel, putting little scores in them to break them into smaller pieces easily. And with these guys, because they're a longer stick to start with, I'm just shoving them through the bandsaw and knocking out little pieces. So it seems to work nicely. Of course, break the bond with the pry bar, and then push back down on it. Use the staple lifter for pulling out the staple. And of course, that by doing it that way, you prevent getting putting a bunch of scores in the surface of the planking itself. And it's not that this planking is precious or anything, because it's going to get covered over. I'm not worried about that, but I'm using this as an opportunity to develop sort of a good repetitive process for dealing with the finished planking. Try to find the best way to deal with holding it down and processing these bits and pieces as I go, so that I get a the best possible result. And when when I do this finished planking, I want to try and keep the staples right there into the joint as opposed to laying it on the surface of the plank at all. I'll probably have to do it here and there, but my goal was always to try and lay it in the joint as much as I can. And I found if you can, hopefully that works well. But every now and then you get one plank that's sitting a bit proud, and it seems like if you don't run the staple through that plank itself, it doesn't lay down quite as nicely. It might be different with the finished product because I'm going to be using lighter planking. You know, it's going to be net out at 2 millimeters, so probably we might make it maybe 2.5 to start with, so I have enough meat for fairing it out. And I'm even developing better techniques for actually putting these planks down. So this last batch, I was just worrying about fastening at the keelson and at the shear line of the mold, and just leaving the rest floating. Basically, I knew I had a good fit, and then schmuck all my epoxy in there. I come along afterwards, I kind of skim off the bulk of the squeeze out as much as I can, then staple down, and there's usually a little bit more squeeze out that happens after stapling. I clean that up and give it a wipe down with my cloth just to try and eliminate the bulk of the sort of epoxy sticking out all over the place. It's not perfect, but it's not too bad. All right, I've got a plank in the steam box here, and what I'm finding as I'm moving forward, while I'm getting less and less plank reduction along the sides, and by that I mean the amount that I need to trim away, it's becoming a very small amount, I'm having to put more effort into bending the planks around the keelson here. And so it kind of means that the effort stays the same, it just changes. And it's been kind of curious how often I've discovered this on this boat, where one thing gets easier but another thing gets more difficult. It's been really challenging and interesting at the same time. This last couple planks, I got them looking really good, and then when I went to bend them on, I glued them in place, I fastened them in place, and then I found that they were just flaring out too much. And it has something to do with the fact that it was only until I had them fully fastened here that I could fully understand exactly what the shape back here needed to be. And so I had to do a fair bit of corrective stuff along the way. I'm not 100% happy with how they came out. Actually, this one's fitting fine. It's the one that's before it that was flaring out more than I would like it to be. It'll be okay once it's all tacked down, but it just means I'm going to be a little more careful in the future about how I go about doing this. Just waiting for a plank to come out of the box. Where are we at here? Oh, just 20 more seconds, so let me make sure I got the stuff in place that I want. Keeping a clamp on hand, clamping pad. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm back to steaming. And there we go. Quiet. And what I'm doing is clamping it in place, getting as much bend in there as I can, and then letting it sit for a while, and then I'm over to the hot iron to try and tweak this in a little bit harder, because there's only so far I can get it with this steaming process. It's pretty good, but it's that last little bit that is a hard enough bend that I really need to put some more concentrated effort into it, and I'm not getting it through the steaming process alone. So here we go, one out, the next one in. We'll worry about setting the timer in a moment. And I need to leave a reasonable amount of overhang here. And then I'm stuck here for a little while, just like this, until I can get everything in place to try and clamp it down properly. But it's those first few moments, as I've mentioned in the past, that are so critical to getting it done well. This clamp, spring clamp, does a nice job of getting it around the bend. And now I've got some flare here I want to try and tease down. So I've got my longer cleats not close at hand. Once again, not prepared the way I ought to be. Oh, no, right there. Come on. I'm kind of wishing I had sort of made this mold with maybe a bit more of a gap along where the keelson is, just so I can clamp onto it a bit better. I didn't do that. I didn't think I needed to do that, but I'm proving myself wrong a little bit there. So I'm just doing this. I'm just tacking this down. There's very little resistance down here, but you know, you want to get as much of that flare out of there as possible, and a lot of it has to do with just the way the plank wants to lie, but when you got so much shape happening at one end, it can really affect what's going on farther back a little more than you would like it to. It's kind of interesting how tight my joint is here. It's almost like perfect just the way it is. In fact, I'm almost tempted to try and drive it home a little bit. That. It's almost perfect. It's just this last little bit down here, right here at the very tip, that it needs to get a little shavy in order to come up super tight through this area. I'm just wondering if there's any kind of clamp I can get in there. You see about a little F-body clamp. No, not so much. At the very least, I can put a little more squeeze on it with this than I can with the spring clamp, though it's pretty tenuous. Clamps like this don't like anything but a hard surface to really grab onto. I don't like a springy surface that could move on you. That's where quick grips are really nice. They can hang on to all kinds of oddball shapes. Okay, so there we go. That's squeezed in there. I got 10 minutes before the next one's out, or maybe 8 minutes. So I just burned a few doing that. But by the time that one's ready to come out and go onto the boat, I'll have this one off and I'll go over to the iron and I'll put in some time trying to tweak that into shape. So while it's the way it is, two things: registration mark, of course, and then up here, this isn't really my finished shape, but I'm just going to just lightly draw in sort of where my center line is. And I'm also sketching in the outside edge of my keelson because this is the area I need to make sure that I've put to the iron to really kind of tweak into shape. I mean, that's a close enough fit. I'd be perfectly happy going ahead and just fastening it in just the way it is. Bevel it off, of course, a little bit. But I'm getting a little bit of a discrepancy from one side to the other at the moment, just a tiny bit, like a 1/16 of an inch. So I want to try and tweak that out a little bit. And I'll do that by scribing the edge on both sides consistently with both planks set at a common reference point and using the same distance of scribing between the two. I got to be careful exactly how much attitude I give the plank, because I feel like if I were trying to bend it square across here, I'd have a harder time making these bends than I do if I come off at an angle. I feel like that I can get twist into this that's more extreme than I could get just straight up square bending. And I've got a lot of shape happening up here in the forefoot. And this area we would call the forefoot right here, just behind the stem, and by the time you reach basically the water line is what we would call the forefoot. And in more traditional parlance, we also refer to this as the gripe, although gripe is technically portion of the stem construction if you look at a larger, like full stemmed, full keel boat. So when we get into oddball, sort of more modern designs like this, some of these terms start to lose some of their relevance, but we can still use them anyway. Okay, we're going to do a little bending here. So I do that and I wet the back of my plank, and I've got my lines drawn on where the keelson is, and I'm following the angle that those lines have. You'll notice sometime between then and now I burned out the electrical element in my bending iron, so I've switched to a torch. That seems to be working out okay. If my iron's at the right temperature, it gives me a little sizzle without any burning. And you just gotta sort of carefully massage this guy over that iron. See, there's a fair bit more curve in there already than what was there when I started. It's especially past the bend here, past the point that it gets chopped off, that I need to put some work into it, because that's where, you know, as soon as I chop it off, it's going to want to spring back a little bit if I don't do this. And of course, this whole process is followed up by using the iron to dry out the wood enough that I can actually glue it within the next little while. So one of the reasons I'm not pre-soaking this wood for the purposes of steaming is because I need to be able to fasten it. And if it's super saturated, I'm just not going to be able to do that with epoxies and have them bond properly. Not without moving to a different epoxy. I could be using West System G-Flex, and that's fine stuff, but I don't find it very friendly to work with in terms of, you know, the mixing procedure. It's largely done by eye. It's a 50-50 mix, and I don't like the finished consistency is kind of thick and honey-like. And I find that kind of awkward to work with. You know, a little bit of overbend isn't a problem because I can always flatten it back out pretty easily. But that's looking good. Look at that right there. Just doing a little bit of tweaking, trying to make sure there aren't any sort of ugly flat spots. And I can't quite check it properly because the spot it has to sit in is now being taken up by the other plank that's in its cooling stage. I'll just put a little bit of bow into it here. I'm doing this partially just to dry up the wood and partially to give it a bit of shape. There we go. That looks pretty nice. Okay, I'll take care of that with the other plank, and then we'll be ready to fasten it in place. Okay, this plank is just about ready to be installed. So I've got it fastened up at the stem here, and one of the things I've found with these guys is you get it in place and everything looks great, the seam looks great, but it tends to want to flare out a little bit down here. And so the only way you can really fix that is by trying to swing the plank up this way. If you notice as I twist, or even if I just shove it upwards, this edge starts to drop towards the hull here, or towards the mold. And so that's been kind of the challenge, is to slowly tweak it up. And the way you tend to do that is just by shaving off on the back edge here. And of course, you have to be careful because you're making your plank a little bit smaller as you do that. So I'm trying to find just the right amount that I scribe it back in the first place, leaving me a little bit of meat to swing it up into the bottom here so that it matches the other side. And I'm just about there. I've got my edge beveled off, so that's good. I could probably use a little bit more of a bevel right here, looks like. So I'm not adjusting my fit of the plank here as I do this. I'm just knocking a little bit off the face, the front corner. So there we go. I got a little strong 1/16 of an inch of space to push epoxy into. Got it pinned down at the bottom, and I'll put a couple staples down here. And it's hugging pretty good here. It's going to flare up a tiny bit just because you can't really avoid that. But for the most part, it's hugging tightly. I don't want to go so far overboard that now it's wanting to pop. You can see how it's wanting to pop out a little bit here now. So there's a happy medium at which it wants to sit there properly. So you got to find that. Now I just need to cut the miter up here. Let's take a closer look. One thing I've done is I'm stacking my washers a little bit. When I go to do my final fastening, I've got a little bit of untapped material down inside that keelson for those screws to bite in. So now I'm just going to try and saw this back to match the other side. So I've already done the one side. And this has been one of the challenges, is getting these planks fitting nicely up here at the miter. Sometimes it works great, and then sometimes they're pushing too hard against each other, and then I'm fighting with them after I've got glue in place, which I certainly don't like. And sometimes I'm a little farther back, and I end up with sort of a sloppy looking joint like I have here. Not that it really matters, but you know, you want it to look nice, so every opportunity to sort of improve your skill set I think is worthwhile. So there, I got that started, and I'm going to switch saws. There we go. And we'll just run the other one up against it and see how that fits. I don't mind a small gap, that's just fine. In fact, I'll just shave the back end here off a hair. There we go. So I'm leaving a little whisker in there. It's like a 32nd of an inch or something like that, and that's perfectly fine. I don't mind that. I'd rather have that than have them butting up against each other and causing a difficult fit. In fact, I'm going to chamfer back that inside corner just a hair there. It'll fill with epoxy, but that's going to ensure that I don't run up hard against the other one by accident. Nice. Okay, so these are ready to go. And my miters are coming out exactly the same here, which is perfect. That's exactly what I want to see. I keep doing things a little different on each one. I think today I'm just going to leave this one in place just the way it is. I'm going to glue and fasten this one in place, and then I'll pop that off and do that one. So it doesn't hurt to have some pencil lines so you know exactly where to put your glue. Okay, so I find a little palette knife is the best tool that I've found for putting the epoxy in here. And a couple things that I've done to help make this whole process a little bit easier is I've got, you know, a separate set of screw guns and drills for fastening each side, and that's just because they all seem to be not close at hand. You know, every time you go to do one side, it's on the other side. So that was making me sufficiently crazy that I decided to do something about that. And so this was the simplest solution. I'm just going to be very careful I don't over tighten. That feels good. And I've even gone so far as to buy a separate staple gun so that I've got a gun going on each side of the boat too. And you know, the gun is like 50 bucks. It's so worthwhile doing that because it's made life a million times easier just being able to sort of reach over and grab the one that's on this side as opposed to dragging it all the way around and fighting with the hose the whole time as well. So that's fastened in place there. I might want to just pop a screw in through the face of the plank somewhere up here just to help pin it down a bit because it's got a bit of a hump right here. I've decided I'm not going to worry about having the odd screw hole in here or there because it's, you know, well worth it to have this thing shaped properly. And all those holes are going to get buried anyway. Okay. A couple staples at the shear, and what I'll do is I'll come back after I finish this, fasten this other side, and I'll work epoxy into these joints and then put my little pads over top of the joint. All right. I'll make sure that we get a little bit of epoxy into that joint itself there too. Now there's going to be a little squeeze out down on the inside where the planking leaves the keelson, and I'm not really worried about that. It'll all get cleaned up later on. I can get in there with the heat gun and scrape all of that away. It's pretty good. Just make sure that's all nice and tight before I staple it down. Okay, now all I do is I just work my way along. Just going to fire this into the joints. If I haven't said it before, the purpose of opening up these joints, having this larger V joint, is in order to stitch these planks together so that I can ferre them off properly before the next layer of planking without having to staple them to the mold, because I don't want to be fastened to the mold. I want to be able to pop this thing off without any trouble. If this were a bigger boat where I'd be rolling it over and destroying the mold inside, then it would make sense to use like plastic staples and just fasten the daylights out of it. And I do question whether or not I should have done that at times. But for whatever reason, I opted against doing that. So now I'm just going to quickly scrape up the excess. I grab a cloth with a little bit of alcohol on there. And I'm just doing a real light wipe down just to make sure so it isn't a super mucky mess. Try not to wipe it out of the seam, although it's hard to not do that to a certain degree. And as soon as I start stapling, a bunch more comes popping up too, so there's only so far I can take this before it's a waste of time. Okay, stapling now. I got to make sure I'm hitting something on the back. I'm kind of wishing I'd gone for a more solid mold sometimes, but doing it sort of partial was just a time-saving measure. For the most part, it's okay. Every now and then I miss a spot. Now I'm trying to drop the staple right down into the seam as much as possible, just for looks. And again, this is more about practicing for the next layer where it'll show. Good. That's all there is to it. I'm going to come back and I got this last previous seam that I need to deal with as well. But that's it in a nutshell.
As we progress through this 4-foot area, those bends along the keelson only increase. You can see how at about 1/4 of the distance back, how extreme those bends are right around the tip of the plank where they come together at the center line. And that's a difficult place to get a bend in a plank. And as we move forward, it gets even more and more extreme. By the time I get to the very last couple planks, I think I even had to thin them down a little bit because I just could not get them to take that tight bend. But we got there in the end.
Well, I am down to the last few planks here, and I gotta tell you, it is so nice to be wrapping up this job with just some simple straight planks, because after all this fighting and fussing, it's really refreshing. I'm just pre-fitting a few of these here just to make things go a little bit simpler. Pretty straightforward. There, that one's gonna go there. It's already trimmed to length. This one needs to be trimmed to length. I'm running out of fingers. I'll save the last one for last. Just gotta go trim that off with the bandsaw. That one's ready to go. That one and that one both need trimming. We'll fit that one last. Be right back. Last shot of epoxy. Like using these little tiny Dixie cups for a lot of my epoxy work. They hold, you can get maybe up to 3 shots at about the most, and then it's just a bit too much epoxy for the size of the cup. But I just like the fact that they're minimal waste. They're a little on the skimpy side in terms of standing up. They sometimes fall over a bit on me if I'm not careful, but certainly with a stir stick in them, they're fine. As soon as you stick an acid brush in them, they want to fall over. There we go. Quite quick here. Leave the last little bit unglued for the moment. while I'm at it, because it's easy, I'm just going to quickly throw my bead of glue on that edge there. A little faster than stuffing it in. I haven't been doing that up till now just because it's been more convenient to not have the plank covered in glue as I'm working. Wet down with the alcohol. These last couple of planks, I thinned them out towards the end. They're sort of tapered right now, specifically just to try and get them to wrap around this tight curve, which worked pretty good. But of course now it leaves a bit of a step on these guys, so I'm going to have to shave these guys down a little bit to fair it all in. Not a big deal. Got to do what you got to do to get the job done. And then the last one here, just got to clean up the goo out of that joint. I'm just going to run this guy a little bit oversized. There we go. There we go, that is it. Hallelujah. Of course, I still got the whole next run of planking to worry about. That's going to be, in some ways, trickier. If I recall when I was doing the model, the secondary layer was a little easier to handle for some reason. I don't remember why. I think it just wasn't quite as tortured. And that's actually a common thing with cold molding, is the planking running one direction is all a little easier to do than the one running in the other direction. Last. Go. And that's it. Beautiful. Tomorrow I'll be able to sort of take all this junk off of here and ferret it all out, and that's great. It'll be an ugly day of fairing, but that means that if I can pull that off, that means next week I'm on to my second run of planking. I'll spend the first day milling, obviously, although it didn't take a ton of time to mill these out. I thought it would be worse than it was. Mahogany might be a little different. It's a little, tougher, harder, obviously. Might be a little harder on the saw blades. And I haven't decided what I want to do about trying to get it a consistent thickness, because this is a little bit, there's some slight, very slight variation in thickness, almost nothing, but it fares out really easily, and the Sapele is certainly not going to be as easy. So I just need to sweep up, weigh all my shavings, and then I'm done. Minus my tail is 875. 573 grams. Alright, I'm going to add up exactly how much material went into there. I'm kind of curious to know exactly how heavy this boat is at this point. Let's see. 2 times 6, 5 times 5, 10, 15, 20, 21, 200 times 4, 800, and 63 times 11, 272 times 2, 5 times 2, 73, 182 times 2, 708, 3 plus 800. Okay, I crunched all the numbers, and we are currently sitting at 16 kilos and 116 grams. So that's pretty damn good. Times 2.2, so 35 pounds. Not too shabby.